Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sports Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host, Nelson, here on this Monday afternoon. This is right after, most of the Wildcard games have been concluded, so I'm going to talk about the Wildcard games that took place over the weekend and give my thoughts on every single game that happened. Then in the second segment, I'm going to talk about the Ohio State game, the game against Texas for the NCAA championship, for competing for a spot in that tournament and in the finals, and just, my thoughts on how that game went down. And then in the third segment, because I'm assuming that this first segment is going to go on a little bit longer than what I would hope, I have a third segment lined up to where I can talk about the playoff games a little bit more, as well as the wild card game that's going to take place later on tonight, because as we know, there's still one more game left to be decided before all of the playoff teams are decided in which team is going to go ahead and face which team in the wild card round. So, in the divisional round, excuse me. Then in the fourth segment, we're going to talk about the NBA games that happened over the weekend, and we also have a special fifth segment at the end, so be sure to stay tuned for that if you guys are interested in figuring out what that is. Before I begin, I would like to remind everybody that we love to hear what you guys have to say during the show, whether it's a hot take, whether it's a burning question, something you're dying to share. We're all ears, and if you really want your comment and or question to get noticed, then I recommend using Super Chat. You just use the $sign. You just click on the $sign below the chat box and send in your comments and or donations that way. If Super Chat's not really your thing, then you can always use the link displayed below the ticker, gsmcspodcast.net, and you can send in your comments and or donations that way. They both really help the show, make it much more interactive between myself and you guys. So let's go ahead. Let's talk about the NFL wildcard games. But first, we have to talk about all of the teams that ended up losing in the wild card. Now, the first team to lose is, of course, the Dallas Cowboys. Now, I know what you're thinking, but they aren't in the playoffs. So how did they lose? Well, I just got a report saying that they just lost Mike McCarthy, their head coach. Both teams, they couldn't agree on a deal to extend Mike McCarthy, so they both just mutually decided to part ways. So even when they're not in the playoffs, they still lose, even though I would have loved to see Mike McCarthy coach for the Cowboys for a million years, or however long he stays alive and well to coach a team, because he never lets the Cowboys down, at least in my eyes. When you need him most, he always shows up. But realistically, I mean, the first team to lose in the wild card, aside from, all jokes aside, is the Chargers. They went up against the Texans. That was the first wild card game over the weekend, and a little bit of a letdown performance. I really thought that the Chargers were going to be able to pull off the upset. If there was any team that was going to pull off an upset in the wild card round, I would have expected the Chargers to be able to do that against the Texans, even though, I don't know if you would want to call it an upset, because while the Texans did have home field advantage and they did win in their division, they did not have a better record than the Chargers did throughout the entire year. The Chargers won one more game than the Texans all year, but despite this, it didn't really feel like the Chargers were the better team in this one. They ended up losing 32-12. The Chargers offense really just could not get it going up until the end of the game, where they scored more or less a garbage time touchdown at the end of the game, and even then they still couldn't convert on the extra point. They ended up the ball ended up flying high into the sky, and the kicker ended up recovering the ball. But this game is mainly going to be highlighted for Justin Herbert's 4 interceptions that he threw in this game. He finished the game throwing for 242 yards, 1 touchdown, a QBR of 40, and those 4 interceptions that I just mentioned. It was a very bad game for Justin Herbert, and this does not help his playoff resume in the slightest. Throughout his entire career, it's been labeled that he was a quarterback that is very talented and can win you a lot of games, but that was basically the only thing that the Chargers really had going for them. Now the narrative seems to be shifting a little bit to where it's like, even though Justin Herbert is an incredible talent, when you need him to show up most in these big games in the postseason, he ends up vanishing. This is already his second postseason loss in his entire career. The first time he lost to Trevor Lawrence and the Jaguars, where they blew like a 30-point lead, and they could not score at all in the second half, which was, again, that was a huge choke for the Chargers. And now in this one, where he throws 4 interceptions to completely lose the game. And it's not like the Texans were all that dominant on their offense either. I mean, they were pretty good on the ground, where Mixon ended up running for 106 yards, and Stroud threw for 282 passing yards. He did throw a touchdown, but he also threw an interception. But this game it was mainly they put themselves in a good position to win just because of, how often Justin Herbert was turning the ball over, which is not something that they can really guarantee on going forward, especially in their next matchup, since I believe the Texans are going to have to play against the Chiefs. And going up against the Chiefs, you're not going to get as many turnovers with Patrick Mahomes as you are with Justin Herbert. Like, that's just not going to happen. So they're going to have to really tidy up their offense, and their offense was the biggest weakness and the biggest concern for them going into this game, in my opinion. They were lucky that their defense was able to hold firm, because the Chargers more or less relied entirely on Justin Herbert's right arm, because they only got 50 yards on the ground. They were not able to do anything running the ball offensively. And so when you're stuck to just passing the ball, it makes you a lot easier to read. It makes you a little bit more predictable. It makes the chances of throwing interceptions like the way Justin Herbert did all that more likely. So they're really going to have to tidy up their offense, and this is just an embarrassing loss for the Chargers, in my opinion. Now, the next game that happened on that day was the Ravens going up against the Steelers. Another embarrassing game for the Steelers. Now, while the score was 28-14, this game was basically over right after the first half. I mean, the Steelers, they did not score until the third quarter, and by then it was basically too late, because Baltimore was already up 21-0, and then the Steelers, they finally answered with a touchdown. But then the Ravens responded that with a touchdown play of their own, which only lasted for 4 plays. And then once that happened, it was just really difficult for Pittsburgh to get back into the game, as both teams would exchange punts up until the end of the fourth quarter, where the game was concluded. And again, this is sort of the outcome that we expected. Well, unlike the last game, this was the outcome that we expected in this one. I mean, there was just, the Steelers had no actual answer for the Ravens, despite and TJ Watt, he did not record a single stat in this game, which was rather surprising, how somebody so dominant is just not that big of a factor in this really big and important game. And I mean, Lamar Jackson, he threw 175 yards. He threw for 2 touchdowns. And on the ground, they were really good. Derrick Henry accumulated 186 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns. And Lamar Jackson got 81 rushing yards. No rushing touchdowns, but again, 81 yards as a quarterback. That's obviously just great performance right there. With this performance, Derrick Henry had tied Terrell Davis for the most 150-yard playoff rushing games in their entire career. So that's an amazing achievement for Derrick Henry right there. And an interesting stat for the Steelers: the Seahawks, the Chargers, the Falcons, the Giants, the Lions, the Vikings, the Cowboys, the Colts, the Browns, the Ravens, the Texans, the Titans, the Jags, the Saints, the Packers, the Bills, the Bengals, New England, Tampa Bay, the Eagles, the Chiefs, the Rams, and the 49ers, they have all won a playoff game more recently than the Pittsburgh Steelers have won a playoff game. So this is sort of the situation where they're in, and why a lot of people want Mike Tomlin fired. They wanted A lot of Steelers fans, they're really sick of constantly having these winning records and constantly making it to the postseason, because more often than not, their team is usually not good enough to win a postseason game. And because they're too good to really lose out the season, and they're not so bad that they lose these big games, but like they're actually, I need to find a way to rephrase that. Hold on. So they're good enough to win you a lot of regular season games, but they're not good enough to win you any playoff games. You're stuck in like a realm of mediocrity, because a lot of Steelers fans, they would much rather have a losing season so they can actually get a rebuild, maybe get better assets at the offensive position, primarily at quarterback, and build around that quarterback and actually have a rebuilding year, as opposed to just constantly winning, and once the playoff comes, you don't win anything. It's sort of a cycle that they're tired of constantly repeating, which is why a lot of people want Mike Tomlin fired. And it makes him sound spoiled, while at the same time makes a little bit of sense. But again, I think it's more often than not, it's like a mentality of just being rather spoiled, because like you're suffering from winning a bunch of regular season games. You have any idea how much I would love for that to be my problem, that we keep winning in the regular season, that we are a good squad, that we constantly win? Like, do you realize how I would love to have that problem? Like, but that's obviously besides the point. So those were the two playoff games that happened on Saturday, and I was looking at the time. Unfortunately, I was unable to get through all of them, which I completely expected, which is why I'll do that in the third segment. But going into the second segment, I'm going to talk about the NCAA game between Ohio State and Texas, because that one was a really good game on Friday. So I'll give my opinions on that right after this short break, so be sure to stay tuned.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
And we are back with the second segment of the GSMC Sports Podcast, presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Excuse me. And in this second segment, we are going to talk about the Ohio State game between Ohio State and Texas, the NCAA playoff game, whatever you guys want to call it. Before I begin, I would like to remind everybody that we love to hear what you guys have to say during the show, whether it's a hot take, whether it's a burning question, something that you're just dying to share. We're all ears, and if you really want your comment and or question to get noticed, then I recommend using Super Chat. You just click on the $sign below the chat box, and you can send in your comments and or donations that way, or you can use the link displayed below the ticker, gsmcpodcast.net, and you can send in your comments and or donations that way as well. They both help the show. They both make it much more interactive between myself and you guys. So let's go ahead, get into this college football playoff game. Ohio State game, Texas game, whatever you want to call it. But the Ohio State the Buckeyes, they were able to win this game 28-14. Now, despite the game not really looking as close as it was a really close game. I mean, both of the quarterbacks, they played rather well, at least up until the very end. Will Howard completed 24 of his 33 pass attempts, threw for 289 yards, threw 1 touchdown, as well as 1 bad interception, but excuse me. Aside from that, this was a great game from Ohio State, and especially their defense late in the game. Texas, Quinn Ewers ended up recording 283 passing yards, ended up recording 2 touchdowns and 1 interception as well. Arch Manning was able to get into this game, but of course he came in as a running option at the quarterback, and he rushed in for 8 yards. No more of that going into the future, because now Texas has confirmed that Archie Manning, is going to go ahead and take the Archie Manning, whatever you want to call him. He's going to go ahead and take the helm at quarterback and be the full-time starter for Texas for what I assume is going to be the next 2 years, assuming he doesn't get drafted directly after next year. But he's going to be the starting quarterback for Texas. And a lot of people, a lot of Texas fans are really excited for Arch Manning to take the helm, because of course, that is just continuing the Manning legacy of being a great quarterback and being a good quarterback around family, because that's sort of like, when you have that last name, you're expected to be a talent that's worth going to the NFL and most likely worth winning a Super Bowl with. Now, this game, it was really decided on at the very end of the game on a 4th down play, because this game was really close throughout the entire game. Again, it was 28-14. Ohio State, they opened up with a touchdown in the first quarter to make the score 7-0. Then both teams had to punt several times up until the very last play of that drive, where Texas, Texas, I guess I could call them that. The Longhorns, that's a better name. That's a better word for it. The Longhorns, they ended up scoring a touchdown late in the second quarter, but then Ohio State responded right back with a touchdown of their own to make the score 14-7 going into the second half. And now going into the second half, Ohio State, they started out with the ball, but they threw an interception, a rather costly interception. They're lucky that it did not result into any points on the other end. Texas had to punt, and then Ohio State had to punt one more time, and then the Longhorns converted on a touchdown drive to make the score 14-14 going into the fourth quarter, and the stage was set for one of the best endings in a college football game. Now, Ohio State, they opened it up with a touchdown after the Longhorns punted, but then the Longhorns responded with a rather long touchdown drive that got them into the red zone and a really good opportunity to win right here. But this was where a lot of Texas fans started to pull their hair out, because on 2nd and goal, they decided to run a toss play, which was seen as rather controversial, especially late in the game. A lot of Texas fans were wondering why on earth would the coach call that kind of play in a 2nd and goal situation, because usually to run a toss play, you're tossing the ball really far back, and there's a really good chance that if the defense is good enough, and knowing Ohio State's defense, that you'd most likely get tackled before you're able to pass the line of scrimmage. And that's exactly what happened, which caused a lot of Texas fans to get really upset, because it's like, why are you running that play on a 2nd and goal situation with the game on the line? That's a lot of Texas fans were really upset at that, and that was capitalized on after Ohio State ended up on 4th and goal, getting a very big stop. And you can see in this image right here, what happens later is a strip sack fumbled, which was returned all the way back 98 yards for a touchdown to make the score 28-14, or 27-14. They nailed the extra point directly after that, and that made the score 28-14 going into the fourth quarter, and late into the fourth quarter to end the game. And now the rest of the game was basically garbage time, but Quinn Ewers threw his last pass and his as a Texas Longhorn, and that was an interception, which sealed the win for Ohio State at 28-14. So again, this game was a lot closer than what the score would have you believe. Like, it really came down to a 4th and goal on the very last play of the drive before the interception. And it was this was a fantastic game, and it was really decided right after that fumble, and more so the return than like the actual fumble itself, because there was still a slight chance that Texas would be able to come back and at the very least tie the game, assuming that the fumble wasn't returned all the way for 6 points. But regardless, obviously that interception at the end of the game is what really sealed the win completely, but you can argue that it was already sealed once Sawyer ended up making that strip sack fumble and returning that fumble all the way for 6. And again, that is one of the best ways for a game to really conclude. Like, when game on the line, this one play completely decides the entire outcome of the game, and boom, the strip sack fumble happens. That was but all in all, this game was very, very impressive. I mean, it was a very strict defensive game. Ohio State, they seemed like they could do more against Texas's defense than Texas was able to do against Ohio State. One of the only times when Ohio State really messed up on defense was when they went into man coverage. At least that's sort of my opinion on it, because they started leaving receivers wide open on several plays, and the receivers just ended up making the play for a touchdown. More specifically, the receiver that I'm talking about was Jaden Blue, who ended up recording 2 touchdowns. Both of his touchdowns came on like routes where he ended up beating his man down the field, and all that was needed was a well-placed ball to put the ball in the end zone. And that's sort of what happened. I will say, however, that throughout most of the game, receivers were suffering from several drops. There were times where a receiver could have converted on 3rd down, but ended up dropping the ball. This happened a lot in the first quarter. In the first half, more so than it happened throughout the entire game. So if they would have converted on some of those catches, we might be seeing a completely different outcome. But nonetheless, that's sort of what happens when you don't capitalize on the plays that the defense gives you. Because it's not like the receivers were entirely clamped. It's not like each receiver was being guarded very, very strictly. Like, they'd have plays where they're wide open and they just could not capitalize on said plays. But Ohio State determined, and they showed that they were the team that can capitalize on big plays, and that was ultimately what ended up propelling them to win this game in the end. Being able to make the big plays and being able to capitalize on those big plays. And that's usually a recipe for success in several football programs. So that's all that I have in this second segment. So now we're going to go into the third segment where I continue talking about these wild card games and how they concluded. So I'll be right back after this short break. Be sure to stay tuned if you guys are interested.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
And we are back with the third segment of the GSMC Sports Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. And in this third segment, I'm going to continue talking about the wildcard games that took place over the weekend, because I have 3 more that I have to look at, and I'll go ahead and go into my predictions for the wildcard game that's going to happen later on today. The wild card game that's happening later is going to be the Rams going up against the Vikings. So that's going to be a very nice game to watch later on tonight for Monday Night Football. So the next game that we have to talk about is the Broncos going up against the Bills. This one was the game that I wanted to pay a little bit more close attention to compared to the other first round wild card games that would end up taking place, because of all the games, I thought that this one could end up being an upset in favor of the Broncos, but that's not what happened in this game whatsoever. They started out really good, scoring a touchdown on the very first play. Bo Nix became the first rookie since, I want to say, maybe like 1962 or something like that, or maybe 1983. I don't know. The years are a little bit... I know it was a very long time. It was the first time in a very long time that a rookie quarterback was able to open up the drive, open up their first playoff drive, scoring a touchdown. And the Bills, they responded that with a field goal, and then they would later respond back with that with a touchdown of their own to make the score 10-7. And it started to look like, a really close game, but late in the second quarter, the Broncos ended up missing a field goal that would have tied the game at 10-10. Going into the third quarter, the Bills, they ended up nailing a field goal to make the score 13-7. They were one play away still from being able to make this game competitive, but then they had to punt. And then the Bills scored a touchdown on their next possession, making the score 21-7. Then the Broncos, they had to punt again, and then the Bills scored another touchdown after that, where that would make the score 28-7 going into the fourth quarter. And then the Broncos, they turned it over on downs, which resulted in the Bills kicking a field goal to make the score 31-7. And then Bo Nix threw his interception, which ended the game at 31-7. So again, not a very competitive game, and one of the least competitive game as we look into the not college football playoffs, as we look into the NFL playoffs and the rest of these wild card games. I will say that they weren't, not most of them ended up being not competitive, but this one was very uncompetitive. I mean, 31-7. Then the only touchdown of the entire game coming in the first quarter on the first play, like on the first drive that you have. It was a very, very boring game, and I thought this game was going to be a little bit more entertaining going into the second half, but it was not. And I mean, this sets the stage for a very exciting quarterback duel between Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson, because with this Bills win, now the Bills, they have to go ahead and play Baltimore in the next round. And the Bills, I believe the Bills, they're going to have the home field advantage playing against the Ravens at home. But still, this is going to be a very, very good game. And it's definitely going to be a better matchup than the Chiefs going up against the Texans, in my opinion, because, these two quarterbacks, they're going to be, they're in the conversation for MVP. We still have no idea who the MVP of the league is, even though I'm pretty sure it's going to be Lamar Jackson. His numbers are just much better than Josh Allen's numbers overall, but still, this is going to be a good game. Now, Josh Allen in this one completed 20 of his 26 passes, threw for 2 touchdowns and 272 yards in the air, also was able to get 46 yards on the ground, and James Cook was also able to help Josh Allen, as James Cook accumulated 120 yards on the ground, as well as 1 touchdown. So this was just, a classic domination from the Bills, a dominating performance that we expect from them. Now, the next game on this list, another rather boring game. The Packers, they went up against the Eagles. The Eagles, while the game and the score, it looked like the scoreboard would have you think this was a much closer game than the last one, but it didn't feel like it was a closer game. And I think I speak for everyone when I say that this game felt a lot more like a blowout than the last game that I was looking at. I mean, the Eagles, they opened up this game pretty much as good as you could possibly ask for it. They ended up recovering a fumble off of a kick return, even though a lot of people, they thought that the kick returner had a possession of the ball and was already down. That's besides the point, as the Eagles, they scored on their very first touchdown drive after that mistake. and that quickly made the score 7-0. Now, throughout the entire game, Jordan Love was absolutely pitiful. In the first half, he was almost unable to complete a pass that was farther than 10 yards, and almost every single one of his completed passes ended up going, coming from inside the 10-yard line, right? And any sort of he was barely able to gain 10 yards on any sort of passing play. The teams would exchange punts, then Philly would end up taking a field goal to make the score 10-0, and then that's when everything sort of came crumbling down for the Packers. The Packers, they threw an interception on the first play of the second quarter, but the Eagles, they couldn't capitalize on it, and they had to punt. But then the Packers ended up missing a field goal, still making the score 0-10. And then guess what? The Eagles, they couldn't capitalize on that either, so they also had to punt. And then the Packers threw their second interception going into this one. And then guess what? The Eagles punted again, but still the score was 10-0. So throughout most of the game, the Packers were just one play away from actually getting themselves back into the game, but they were unable to do so. And it was 10-0 at the half is very, very lackluster for this Eagles team, in my opinion, especially when they were given so many chances and when Jordan Love was able to, not really able to do anything, but he was giving them chances and they still couldn't capitalize on that. Then the Eagles, they opened up the third quarter with a punt. Then Green Bay, they responded with a field goal. So they were in this game. All they needed was a touchdown. But then the Eagles, they scored a touchdown. They could not convert. They could not add the extra point onto the board. So that still made the score rather close, 16-3 going into the fourth quarter. Green Bay finally answered with a touchdown to make the score 10-16. But then the Eagles, they made a field goal. Then the Packers turned it over on downs. And the Eagles made another field goal to make the score 20-10. And on the very final drive, the Packers dropped the ball. They threw an interception, and that ultimately sealed the win for the Eagles. So, again, this was a game where Jordan Love just didn't do anything to help the Packers win. Ended up throwing 3 interceptions in this game. He did throw for 212 yards, but again, those 3 interceptions are very, very bad and came at the worst times. Josh Jacob threw for, he ran in for a touchdown, recorded 81 yards. And on the Eagles side, Saquon Barkley, he had 119 yards, but again, this team wasn't really putting the ball in the end zone as many times as you would like. And Jalen Hurts, he ended up recording only 131 yards in the air. He did throw for 2 touchdowns, but again, one of those touchdowns came from really deep inside Packers territory. So, not a very dominant game from the Eagles, but obviously a win is a win. And finally, the last game of the wild card that we've seen so far, the Commanders going up against the Buccaneers. Now, this one was a very competitive game all the way throughout the very end of the game. And this is obviously the Commanders, they ended up winning 23-20. Not an upset, because the Commanders, they did have 2 more wins this season than Tampa Bay, despite Tampa Bay hosting this playoff game. But again, this was a really close game through thick and thin. And Jaden Daniels, he ended up being one of the very few rookie quarterbacks to win their opening playoff game. And they're going to advance into the next round. And I believe they're going to play the Lions in the next round, which should also be a very entertaining game. But again, Jaden Daniels, he ended up recording 268 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. Baker Mayfield also played really well, 185 passing yards, but he completed 15 of his 18 pass attempts. He threw for 2 touchdowns, and he also ran for 23 yards. Now, again, this game was very close. Tampa Bay, they opened up with a field goal, then Washington turned it over on downs, but then Tampa punted, which Washington responded with a 17-play, 92-yard touchdown drive to make the score 7-3. Then Tampa Bay had to punt. Then Washington kicked a field goal to make the score 10-3. And then at the end of the half, the Bucs responded with a touchdown to tie this game. And then Washington opened it up with a field goal. Tampa Bay responded to that field goal with a touchdown. Then Washington turned it over on downs. But luckily for them, Tampa Bay fumbled the ball on a messed up handoff, I think it was, and then Washington responded to that with a touchdown drive to make the score 30-17. Now, then the Buccaneers, they drive the ball all the way down to the other field, and I thought they were going to go for it. With the game on the line, and you're giving your opponent the ball with not very much time on the clock, but still enough time for them to drive down the field and then run the clock out, which is what Washington did. I expected the Buccaneers to go for it in this one. Call me crazy, but in the situation that you're in, you're down by 3 points, and you have enough time to get points back, but you also have the fear of giving the other team enough time to drive down the field. And keep in mind, this is a Washington team that has delivered in the clutch numerous times already in the regular season. I don't think you give them the ball at a tie game when they have enough time to drive down the field. I think in that situation, you just try and go for it. And if they would have gone for it and they would have converted, then most likely they would have been up by a field goal, which would have forced the Commanders to score a touchdown late in the game to try and actually win the game. And at worst, it would tie the game and send it into overtime. I think that's my thought process going into this, because you're giving the ball to Jaden Daniels, who has already proven himself as at least in this season, as one of the most clutch quarterbacks in the NFL right now. I mean, throughout almost every single game that Washington has played, they've sort of relied on Jaden Daniels to sort of win the game for them in the end. In fact, their last regular season game that they played, it came down to the wire where Jaden Daniels had to drive the field in overtime and win the game. So I think in that situation, you have to go for it, so that way you can put a little bit of pressure on Jaden Daniels and the Commanders. But again, there's also the thought process that you don't make it, and you just hope that your defense can get a stop as the game is tied. But again, I feel like against Jaden Daniels, that's more easier said than done. And those are all the Wildcard games that took place over the weekend, and the last game that we still have to review is going to be the Vikings going up against the Rams. And so this game was supposed to take place in LA, but this was moved to a different stadium because of all the fires that are going on in Los Angeles. So really, this could be any of their games, really. Like, any of these guys can win in this game. They're going to be playing at a neutral site. So the fact that they're going to be playing at a neutral site, I think, gives a little bit more advantage to the Vikings, more so than it does to the Rams, because the Rams, they would have been playing in LA, and they would have had that home field advantage going into this game. And really, home field advantage is really important in the NFL. And, I mean, we saw how it affected the Chargers in their game, so maybe this is going to be granted, even with home field advantage, I still don't think that the Rams would have been able to beat them. I have the Vikings winning in that game, but I still think it's going to be a very close game. But now that there's no home field advantage, I'm not entirely sure whether or not I think it's a close game. So we're going to have to see how that game develops. But again, I'm picking the Vikings to win in this one. Even though I don't have faith in Sam Darnold, I have a lot of faith in guys like Justin Jefferson and in the wide receiver room that the Vikings have. So we'll see how that goes, and we'll be sure to tune into that game later on today at 8 o'clock on ABC, for any of you guys wondering. So that's all that I have in this third segment. So now we're going into the fourth segment, where I do a little recap of the NBA games that took place over the weekend. So I'll be right back after this short break. Be sure to stay tuned if you guys are interested.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
And we are back with the fourth segment of the GSMC Sports Podcast, presented by the GSMC GSMC Sports Network. And in this fourth segment, we're going to be doing a quick recap of all the games in the NBA that took place over the weekend, counting Friday, so Friday, Saturday, and Sunday's games that happened. And we'll highlight some of the big games that took place. We'll also, talk about the results of every single game. Look at how the seedings are looking at right now, because they have changed dramatically from the last time that I've seen them and the last time that I went over them. So, the first game that we have is between the Warriors and the Pacers. The Pacers, they ended up beating the Warriors 108-96. Tyrese Haliburton recorded 25 points and 10 assists in this one. Benedict Mathurin recorded 21 points and 10 rebounds in this game, and Siakam recorded 25 points and 9 rebounds. Meanwhile, there was no Steph Curry, so the lack of Steph Curry ultimately means the lack of a win for the Golden State Warriors 9 out of 10 times. So, not really much that needs to be said other than the fact that the Warriors did not have Steph. And the next game that we have is the Thunder going up against the Knicks. The Thunder, they destroyed the Knicks 126-101. Despite the fact that the Knicks had Karl Anthony Towns in this one, it didn't really matter. OG Anunoby was really lackluster in this one. He did not really shoot the ball very well. 2 for 8 from the field, only 4 points. Jalen Brunson had 27. Karl Anthony Towns had 23 and 10. And Mikal Bridges was also unable to shoot in this one. He ended the game 0 for 9, 0 points. And also 0 for 7 from 3. If those two actually were able to shoot in this game, then I think it would have been way more competitive. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander ended with 39 points, and that's really all that you need to know. There's Isaiah Joe also dropped 31 points coming off of the bench, but again, the big issue here was the fact that OG and Mikal Bridges were unable to shoot, and that was a big reason why they ended up losing this game. The next game on this list, the Nuggets, they ended up beating the Brooklyn Nets. Russell Westbrook and Nikola Jokic recorded a triple-double. Russell Westbrook became one of the very few teammates, actually the only teammate to end up recording a triple-double alongside with Jokic that wasn't Jamal Murray, and they did that in, I believe, Game 3 of the NBA Finals a year ago. Now, Jokic, he ended up dropping 35, 15, and 12. Westbrook dropped 25, 10, and 11. So just a great stat line coming in from those two. And on the Brooklyn Nets side, there was really nobody else that was scoring aside from Keon Johnson, who recorded 22 points, 4 rebounds, and 4 assists. Now, this isn't really saying much because this Brooklyn Nets team is a team that is more or less tanking. Like they won't say that they're tanking, even though they sort of did say that they were tanking. They said that they were going to do tactical decisions that might include not putting the best talent out there. So ultimately, when you're not putting your best talent and your best players out on the field and out on the court most of the time, it means that you're tanking. And they're basically indirectly saying that they're tanking. And as indirect as you could possibly get. Because, again, at least in my opinion, when you are a team and you're saying that you're not always going to be putting the best talent out there on the court, then that means you're not really looking to win. And when you're not looking to win, it means you're tanking. And it's a very common thing to do in the NBA, despite the fact that there is a lottery for the first overall pick, which is supposed to prevent tanking from most teams. But again, that's not really the case here. Now, the Pelicans, they ended up beating the 76ers 123-115. And of course, there was no Joel Embiid in this matchup. Paul George dropped 25 and 11 in this one, but still wasn't enough. Maxey had 30 and 12 in this game, and of course that still wasn't enough. Pelicans, they had CJ McCollum, who ended up recording 38 points in this one, and DeJounte Murray, who recorded 17 points, 10 rebounds, and 6 assists. They also were aided by Jordan Hawkins, who recorded 21 points. The Bucks, they ended up defeating the Orlando Magic 109-106, and this was all in Paolo Banchero's return. He ended up, Paolo dropped 34 points, 7 rebounds, 3 assists, and 2 steals. And Damian Lillard had 29 points. Giannis Antetokounmpo had 41 and 14. And again, this was still a really close game, despite the fact that the Orlando Magic is missing Franz Wagner. The Kings, they ended up surprising the Celtics by beating them 114-97. DeRozan had 24 points. Sabonis, had 23 points and 28 rebounds, and Malik Monk had 22 points and 8 assists. Meanwhile, on the Celtics side, Jaylen Brown had 28, Tatum had 15 and 12, and Porzingis had 22 and 10. And the Wizards, they lost to the Bulls 138 to 105. Don't really need to say much. Now, the game that took place in LA was postponed. The Lakers, they were supposed to go up against the Spurs, but that game was postponed. The Rockets, they were supposed to go up against the Hawks, but that game was also postponed. Now, Phoenix against the Jazz. The Phoenix Suns ended up beating the Jazz 114 to 106. The Suns ended up getting Devin Booker to drop 34 points. Kevin Durant ended with 25 points, and Bradley Beal ended with 12 points. Meanwhile, the Jazz, they could not get many people to score 20 aside from Lauri Markkanen and Colin Sexton. Markkanen had 24, Colin Sexton had 20, and Walker Kessler ended up recording 16 points and 13 rebounds. The Pistons, they ended up defeating the Raptors 123 to 114, which is again, the Raptors, they're also a team that's sort of trying to get Cooper Flagg to join their roster. And Cade Cunningham ended up dropping 22 points, 17 assists, and 10 rebounds. A triple-double performance, so a great game for him. Tim Hardaway Jr. ended up recording 27 points in this one. And on the Raptors side, the only real highlight for them was Emmanuel Quickley, who ended up recording 25 points. The game between the Clippers and the Hornets was also postponed, obviously because of the wildfires going on. The Grizzlies ended up beating the Minnesota Timberwolves 127 to 125 after Jaren Jackson Jr. dropped 33 points, and Desmond Bane had 21 points. On the Timberwolves side, DiVincenzo finally had a great game, 27 points and 10 rebounds, but again, it wasn't enough. Anthony Edwards had only 15 in this one, and Jaden McDaniels had 21. Now, going into yesterday's games, the Knicks completely destroyed the Bucks 140 to 106. It was just a ridiculous beatdown. Karl-Anthony Towns had 30 points, 18 rebounds. Jalen Brunson had 44 points in this one. Josh Hart had 11 and 11 rebounds. And Damian Lillard only had 22 points. Giannis only had 24 and 13. Only 24 for Giannis is very few points. And the rest of the starters, they could not get more than 10 points. And the only real star coming off the bench was Chris Middleton, who had 16 points. Again, that's not going to be enough to go ahead and beat the New York Knicks. Not when they have Karl-Anthony Towns. Now, the Denver Nuggets, they ended up beating the Dallas Mavericks. And the Mavericks, they still don't have Kyrie or Luka Doncic. So, it makes sense how the Nuggets were able to win in this one. Jokic had only 19 points, but he did record 18 rebounds and 9 assists. Russell Westbrook had 21 points, recorded 10 rebounds and 7 assists. And Jamal Murray had 17 points. So again, not really much of a surprise because, again, this Mavericks team does not have Kyrie or Luka Doncic, their two best players. So it makes total sense why the Nuggets were able to beat them. Now, the Jazz, they ended up playing the Nets in an overtime game, and they ended up winning 112 to 111. And Colin Sexton had 21 points. Isaiah Collier had 23 points, and that was really all she wrote for the Jazz. The Kings, they ended up playing the Bulls, and they ended up beating them 124 to 119. Lonzo Ball had 15 points in this game. Zach LaVine had 36 points and 10 rebounds, joining, I believe he joined DeMar DeRozan and Michael Jordan as the only Chicago Bulls with 5 or more 35-point games. Now, Sabonis ended up continuing his amazing performance, 22 points, 15 rebounds, and DeRozan had 21 points in his return to Chicago. De'Aaron Fox had 26 points and 9 rebounds in this one. The Thunder, they destroyed the Wizards 136 to 95. The Wizards, they couldn't really get anyone to score 20 points. The only player close to that was Corey Kispert, who ended up recording 17 points, and literally that's it, only recorded points. He did record 1 block, but aside from that, no rebounds and no assists. Meanwhile, SGA recorded 27 points, 7 rebounds, 4 assists, along with 2 steals. Also, they had help from Aaron Wiggins off the bench, who recorded 23 points and 9 rebounds. The Cavs, they ended up losing to the Pacers, ended up losing 108 to 93, a rather surprising loss for them. And it's not like the Pacers, they had anyone, dropping a lot of points in this one. It was more like a team effort. And the Magic, they ended up beating the 76ers. Cole Anthony ended up recording 27 points, and Paolo Banchero had 20 points. Also, I completely forgot to mention this, but Jalen Brunson ended up tying Carmelo Anthony for, I believe, third place as third place for most 40-point games as a New York Knick. Ended up tying Carmelo Anthony yesterday. So just wanted to add that. I completely forgot to mention that. The Celtics, they ended up beating the Pelicans 120-119. Jason Tatum had 38 and 11. Kristaps had 19 and 11. And there was also, it was a very close game. Trey Murphy had 30 points. DeJounte Murray had 26 points, 9 rebounds, and 8 assists going into this one. Zion played in this game. He ended up recording 16 points. But again, it wasn't enough to go up against the Celtics this time around. Phoenix, they ended up playing the Charlotte Hornets. They ended up winning 120-113 in this one. And Phoenix ended up getting Devin Booker to drop 30 points. Again, Kevin Durant had 27 points in this one, and Bradley Beal had only 15 points in this one. LaMelo Ball, dropped 25 points and 11 assists in this one. But he did shoot 9 for 25 from the field, so not very efficient shooting from LaMelo, but again, 25 points and 11 assists. That's a solid game. In fact, I've seen Trae Young shoot worse than LaMelo several nights. But those were all the games that happened over the weekend. So now we're going to go into the fifth and the final segment where I talk about the new NBA power rankings that were released a few hours ago. So be sure to stay tuned if you guys are interested in that. And we are back with the fifth and the final segment of the GSMC Sports Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. And in this final segment, we are going to be looking at the NBA's power rankings for Week 13. They were released a few hours ago, so we're going to go ahead and look at that. I just had to open up the website for a little bit, so I apologize for taking a long time to get that all set up and things like that. So here we have the power rankings going into Week 13. So I don't think the Cavs are going to be the number one team, but then again, I wouldn't be surprised. Okay, they are. I would have figured that their loss to the Pacers would have brought them down a little bit in the rankings, but it doesn't really seem like that that sort of mattered. They won the first matchup between the two best teams in the league. The last time they went around, aside from their Pacers loss, I think it makes sense why they were able to. Why they were able to still be in the top the top spot of all the power rankings. Now, they had their worst offensive performance ever against the Pacers. So I guess, that one bad performance is pushed a little bit under the rug. And They still remain to be one of the best teams on the offensive side of the ball. And, when you're the best team, you could just see that their net rating, being ranked second, it really puts them in a good position. Their defensive rating also being in the top 10 also puts them in a really good spot. Having Evan Mobley there and Jared Allen there as well, that's just great additions to an already, you need those additions, especially when at the guard position, your defense is a little bit meh, at least, with the two starting guards that they have. So having good defenders in the starting lineup to pair with those two offensive powerhouses is pretty good. And obviously, Evan Mobley is just as good on the offense as he is on the defense, and that's saying a lot. Now, OKC, they moved down one. It's really just going to be, it seems like throughout most of the year, those two teams have flip-flopped between the 1 and the 2 spot, with the exception of the Boston Celtics, who remained at the top for a really long time. Now that the rest of the NBA games have sort of concluded on with the rest of the week, then, it's been drawn down to just these two teams flip-flopping between number 1 and number 2. And, of course, the Boston Celtics whenever they feel like joining in the mix as well. So it's like the top 3 teams, they're always going to be Cleveland, OKC, and Boston, but depending on the week, number 1 is probably going to be different. Like, it could be between OKC, it could be between Boston, things like that, so I don't really have any complaints there. Houston, they ended up jumping up to number 4 as opposed to being at number 5. Again, they are one of the top 5 teams in this league, so I have no problem with them being at number 4 or at 5, especially when the team below them is the Memphis Grizzlies. This Grizzlies team, they've been quiet, but despite the fact that they've been quiet, they have been very efficient, and they've sort of done what a lot of people really, expect them to do, right? Like, we expect them, geez, the stutter was real there, but we expect them to be a competent team when they're fully healthy and when they have Ja Morant. So they're not really surprising anyone. I mean, they didn't really have Ja Morant at all last year, which was the big reason why they weren't a competent team. But now that they have him, it makes sense that they're back to winning again. Now, the Knicks, they drop a couple of spots, and that makes a little bit of sense considering how they got destroyed by the Thunder in the last game. And beating the Bucks and by how much that they did most likely kept them from being ranked out of the top 8, at least in my opinion, because that win was just very, very dominant. The Denver Nuggets being stuck at 7, I guess that makes a little bit of sense. They're not really, again, I don't think they're a team that's really going to make it far in the postseason, but so far they seem to have gotten on the right track with Russell Westbrook and with Nikola Jokic. It seems like they're sort of starting to make ends meet. Now, the next team is the Pacers, which is a little bit surprising, but obviously their big win against the Cavs is going to give them a little bit of a boost in their rating. So it makes some sense why they're ranked so high. The Timberwolves, being a top 10 team, I don't necessarily agree with. I mean, their record is already flimsy as it is, and combined with that roster not being nearly as good as what it was last year, I don't think putting them at number 9 is very, makes a lot of sense. Now, the Clippers, they're here because they were unable to play in the last game. I think that if they played against the Hornets, they would have been able to stayed over the Minnesota Timberwolves, at least in my opinion. Because the Clippers, while they also lost a very important player to their rotation, losing Paul George in the beginning of the season, I still think that they are a better team than the Timberwolves. Like, it doesn't feel like they lost. Now, the Dallas Mavericks, they ended up dropping a little bit. Makes sense because, they don't have Luka or Kyrie. They benefited a lot from beating the Lakers and the Blazers without them, but still, it's like not a very competent team when they don't have their 2 best players. Go figure. And the Lakers being dropped down to number 12, I guess that makes a little bit of sense, seeing as how they weren't really able to win that much over the weekend, especially on the road, going 0-2 on a trip to Texas before having 2 games postponed. Not a very good recipe for success there, especially with all of those other stuff that's going on in LA. It's a very big and, a necessary distraction. The Bucks, they move up a little bit despite getting absolutely wrecked by the New York Knicks, which, again, I think moving them down to 16, they did beat the Orlando Magic, which I guess makes sense why they're over them in this week's power rankings, but still, I don't think that the Bucks are a better team when Orlando is fully healthy, and I will say that they are better than the Kings as well, so not really a good example of, and they, given that Jimmy Butler wants to leave the Miami Heat, they're also better than them, so I guess moving them up to just switching the Orlando Magic and the Bucks is like the best move in this week's power rankings, because I do feel like they are better than most of these other teams. But then again, I don't really feel like these other teams deserve the ranking that they're in either. Now, Golden State being ranked at 17, I guess, being in that mid-tier area makes a little bit of sense. The Pistons moving up, finally being positive, 20 and 19. A 9-2 stretch in their last 11 games. Obviously, it's been looking a lot better for Detroit than what it was the last few years, so can't really complain much there. Phoenix being at number 19, again, another mid-tier team. We'll have to see where they rank at the end after they trade away Bradley Beal, if that ends up happening. The Spurs dropping from 15 to 20, that makes sense. Atlanta dropping from 18 to 21. And then the rest of the teams are most likely going to stay the same. Yeah, Philly dropping all the way to 23. That makes much more sense. Portland moving over to here. Utah here. The rest of these teams, being at the bottom of the list. Obviously, there's not really much of a difference between the teams that are on the bottom of this list as there are with the teams on the top of this list. But again, I don't really have a problem with the bottom half of this list whatsoever, and it's usually that mid tier where the Bucks get ranked is where the problem starts. But aside from that, not a very controversial list. At least it's definitely far from the most controversial list that they have. So I have no problems with this list. Let me know in the comments what you guys think of these power rankings. But that's all that I have for today. That's it for the show. Thank you so much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. We also invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. As usual, we love to hear what you guys have to say during the show, whether or not it's a hot take, whether it's a burning question. And if you really want your comment and or question to get noticed, then I recommend using Super Chat. You just click on the $sign below the chat box. And if that's not your thing, you can always use the link displayed below the ticker, gsmcpodcast.net, and you can send in your comments and or donations that way. Either or really helps the show. That's all that I have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I am your host, Nelson, and as always, take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn ain't